So if you've been around the game art scene for the last year or two, you're probably thinking, a tiling brick wall, why? You know, just go into Substance Designer and use the tile generator and knock it out in there, and that's good. And I've seen some incredible brick walls done that way. But sometimes I like to go back and do it the old school way. And there's some valuable information here to be learned, I think, like using instances and tips on how to bake it out and that kind of stuff. So basically what we're going to do is I have some bricks that I've sculpted in ZBrush. We're going to decimate those down to a certain level, pull them into MODO. I'm going to show you how to lay out the brick wall in MODO using instances to cover in the repeating elements. And then we're going to take it to Substance Painter, we're going to bake it down to a plane, and hopefully we'll learn a few things while we're doing it. So let's give it a shot. So real quick, I thought it would just be valuable to look at the bricks we're going to use for this. These are them. There's nothing too fancy about them, but they're different shapes. They have different chunks knocked off, and there's a little bit of there's some pockmarking to give it the look that I want it to have. So even with these being as simple as they are, they're 300,000 points or whatever still. So I'm going to hit them with Decimation Master maybe once. Take it down to at least half that, or maybe even a quarter, because once you start tiling these things up inside a MODO, the scene can get heavy pretty quickly. So I'm going to do that, and I'll see you over in MODO. So the Let's Build series is a little less edited than the quick tips stuff, so I can show you every step, whether that's boring or not. But you get to see more of the process, which I think is also valuable. So here's the bricks I brought back in from ZBrush. You can see that they decimated really well, actually, much lower than I was anticipating. And while the topology is not great, that doesn't really matter to me because I'm not going to be using these in that context. These are really just here to bake from. So I'm going to turn on a matte cap shader just because I like the way that looks, and I'd rather have it look cool. I'm kind of weird that way. So let me pull this out of this imported folder, clean this up a bit. Now if I grab this and I update the smoothing on the vertices, get rid of some of these striations and things. There we go. The mesh tends to come in from ZBrush without smoothing on it, so I just throw it in there. Okay, so with this setup, now what I need to do, this is one big mesh item. So I need to split these bricks off into their own mesh items. I guess I don't have to. Now, you know what? Let's not do that. I want to try it the other way. What I do have to do, though, is we're going to have to set these up to be a uniform size because I want them to stack together nicely. But we also have to do a little math in our heads because we want to make sure that they're going to tile correctly. So if I select all the verts on one and I go into the absolute scaling dialog, okay, this tells me that it's 33 by 34 by 64, which is not all that useful. So instead what I'm going to do is make it 30 by 30 by 60 and hit the explicit scale button, which shrinks it down to that size. Now I just have to select each of the other clusters and hit the button on them to get them to snap in to that same size. And you'll notice that's a 2-to-1 ratio, which is perfect for bricks because that gives us the ability to have a brick, and then the two below are shifted over by half a brick, and so it it all tiles out nicely that way. Do this one and do this one. Okay, so they're all the scale that I want them to be. I can update the smoothing because sometimes when you jigger vertices you need to update a bit. Okay, let me think about this. Yeah, this should work. There's a part of my brain that's nagging me saying, hey, we should split these up, but I think we're not going to do that. And we're going to see how it goes. So with the bricks all set up like this in a way that should work, I'm going to move on to setting up the reference plane that we're going to be snapping them to here in a second. So to start laying this brick wall out, we have to make a reference plane. Well, we don't have to, but I do. So let me drag out a plane here and get started with this. So this is going to be just like a work area. So so I snap this to the origin. Now the size, this is important. So they were 60 across, remember, and 30 by 30 in dimensions. So at 60, if I want one tile of the wall to have 4 bricks across, that's 4 times 60, so 240 units. And yeah, we'll go with that. Well, we'll do 5. So we'll do 6 times 5, which is 300. So that gives us like a 3-meter wall, which is pretty, standard. So with a 3-meter wall, now we just said that we're going to, this is the x-axis, have 5 across, right? So with 5 segments, if I turn on the wireframe, you can see we have 1 slot for each thing, which now at 5 segments across, that means we're going to have 10 down. And there we have slots for each brick. And this is just kind of a helpful thing, because we'll see in a second how we can leverage this. So all that has to happen now is I'm going to grab a brick and I'm going to turn on my snapping, and I'm going to say that I want to snap to polygon centers. And what that means is when I drag this, MODO is going to start looking for the center of polygons that it could snap that brick to, and it finds that one that I just laid in there and snaps it home. So I'm going to give not too much thought to this top row and just drag them in and just snap these first 5 into place. Now, I'll turn off wireframe too, because it's a little distracting and kind of ugly. Pull this down to there, and we'll grab this one for fun and pull him down here. Okay, so there's our top row, and it's all snapped in nicely. Now for this second row, we're actually going to have to change the snapping. And you know what? For the purposes of speed, I'm actually going to move this plane out to its own mesh item, because then when I'm snapping, it won't be trying to snap to all the vertices that are on the bricks, but it'll just be trying to snap to that background mesh. And I'll show you how to do that here in a second. So if I grab this and I want to drag this and have it snap to the same spots again, I need to change this to edge center now. And I need to tell it which layers to snap to, so only snap to background layers. And that should do what I want. So if I drag this down, it snaps to the edge centers, of that background. Perfect. Drag him down and pull him over. All right, so these are all, they're settling in here, and they're looking like they're supposed to look. Now we have a problem because we're out of bricks, but that's where we start to have to get imaginative with it. So I have some hotkeys set up that allow me to flip meshes pretty easily. So when I'm in the scaling tool, so if I make a copy of this mesh, Control C, Control V, and drag him over here so he snaps into place, hop into my scaling tool and hit Control Shift X, for example, which flips it around front to back. And it's the same brick mesh, but you can't tell. And when I do that, I have to update smoothing. So I'll update smoothing. And now this brick and this brick are the same brick, but you can't tell because they're flipped front to back, so it doesn't matter. And the same thing will happen here. I'll copy that out, pull him over when I can find the widget. And just to speed things along, I will grab, let's say, this guy. Why not? He's even in the same row and it won't matter. So pull him over so he overlaps. Sorry, there. Okay, grab this, scale him, flip him vertically and front to back. And he'll just be a simple front to back. Update smoothing. Now you can see this looks like these are really getting out of whack here. This looks like there's a big gap here and that kind of stuff, but that's because this background plane is in the way. If you get rid of the background plane, you can see that they're more or less, uniformly sticking together. They aren't perfect, because meshes, these bricks had carving and sculpting done to them, so they're not exactly square, but we'll fix that at the end. Don't worry. So this being the case, now that I have that top row, I'm going to grab this whole same row again, Control C, Control V, and just make a duplicate of that exact row. Go into the Move tool and tell that I want to pull it down. But I don't need to use the snapping for this because I know that if, well, it should be a total height of 60, so minus 60 should pull it down to exactly where it needs to be. And it does. Then, if I flip that whole thing from front to back, which will take a second, there it goes, and update the smoothing, and we should have a nice second row when that gets done processing. There we go. And that looks, sorry, a little bit of a glitch there. See that, and that looks pretty good. Yeah, but you know what? I'm doing this wrong. Yeah, sorry. I'm not focusing. This doesn't need these two on the end. So we can get rid of this, and I'll tell you why that is. What we're trying to create here is like a zipper pattern, right? So on the left side, you got certain bricks sticking out, and on the right side, you have the opposite bricks that are sticking out. And you'll see what that looks like here in a little bit when we do the instancing. But for now, just have it on faith that these two bricks are going to have to get duplicated from the left side to the right side. But there's an easy way to do that inside of MODO, and I'll show you that in a sec. So I'm going to warp ahead and just get the rest of this filled out with these bricks. It's the same thing. I'm just grabbing bricks, copying them, flipping them, and making sure that it's not too obvious that I've copied bricks from one spot to another. So I'll be right back. Okay, so I filled out the rest of the wall, and I flipped and rotated stuff until I came up with a layout that doesn't have anything that looks like it's really obviously repeating. And you'll recall what I said before about the scene getting heavy. We're just over 400,000 triangles right now, because of all these duplicated pieces. But that's about the max that we're going to go, because from now on we're going to be instancing stuff. And we didn't instance these bricks because they're part of the center masterpiece. You'll see here in a second. So first thing I want to do is I want to grab this thing because I don't need this template anymore. So I'm just going to merge all those polygons back together again. Then grab the bricks and the background piece and merge them together again because I want them as one cohesive mesh. And that'll take a second because of the previously mentioned 400,000 triangles. So there it is. Now it's one cohesive mesh. And it's sitting at the world origin. Now when you go to bake out a tiling texture, the problem you have is that if you just lay in the bricks you need, you end up with stuff like seams in the ambient occlusion, on the edges, and stuff just has weird errors, and you can obviously see the repeating breaks. It's just something that you learn to deal with. And the way that you deal with it is you duplicate geometry from the left to the right and the right to the left, top, bottom, all that kind of stuff. And the easiest way I figured out how to do that is to just instance your master mesh. So if I go in here and I say that I want to make an instance of this, now there's an instance sitting here, and I can drag that instance up. And let's see, we knew that it was 300, right? So 300 snaps it up one whole unit to the top. If I turn on wireframe now, you can see, we have the original and the purple, which, in MODO is how it signifies a mesh instance. So if I grab the instance and duplicate it again with a hotkey, drag him down by 600 because wait, that's wrong. I turned off smoothing in the middle there, which confused it. Negative 600. There we go. Okay. So that covers vertically, right? So now if I go in here and I grab these two, copy them again, and we're going to slide them to the right by 300 units. This is where the zippering comes in that I talked about. Remember how these bricks will line up with these bricks? So you can see that happening here. If I grab this, copy this down, you just have to bear with me while I set this up. Negative 300 down to there. And then grab all of these three, and these have to get duped to the other side. Copy those. Negative 600. Okay. So now, this huge mess of wires is giving you a brick wall that you can bake out with impunity, really, because you've got all of your bricks are set up in a way that repeats nicely. So here's the original here in the middle. You can keep an eye on it. When I turn off the wireframe now, you can see that it's all seamless and geometry's been duped, and we're good to go for the high poly portion of our program anyway. And once I do this, and I'm sure that it's all working, I typically will start to fool with this mesh now. Now what I can do, or what you really should do with these meshes, is since you're hand doing all the geo anyway, you can add a little bit of character to a brick wall just by skewing the bricks a little bit. So let me just isolate my original again, and if I grab, say, this one here, and I tell MODO that I want to do a shear on this brick. Shearing just means that I'm skewing the mesh on whatever axis I skew it on. So if I skew it on X, you can see that one side moves but the other doesn't. So skew it out there a little bit. I don't know, grab this one down here. We'll also, sorry, not skew, shear. Give him a shear, but I want the other side, so I'll reverse that. Shear that side out a little bit. And you can grab some of these bricks and like maybe scoot him in a little bit. And scoot this one, maybe come out a little bit. This is where your arty side can kind of come out. You can start fooling with these things and getting them to look the way you want them to look. Now what I'd like to do here is I like to give some bricks just a very slight tilt, because it helps them to catch the light differently, depending on how the baker sees it. Right, so if I pull him out and just give him a very slight tilt upwards. And it's not really apparent here inside of MODO, but you learn from experience that as you do these things, each little tweak, each little bit of character you can add to the wall helps to sell it, because it looks less mechanical basically. And it doesn't have to be much, just a little bit, because even if you get elements that are similar to each other, if you have one that's skewed and one that's slightly tilted and stuff, you can help to separate it based on how the lighting is hitting it. And because we instanced those are now showing up all around the copies that we made. So one last note. This background plane that we used for the reference, this effectively represents your mortar. So when you bake out, any rays that miss the bricks are going to hit the mortar and register as flat. You can sculpt the mortar out, but we're not going to for this example. But what I wanted you to be aware of is that, and here we'll turn them all on. See, as I move that back plane, let me get the widget. As I move that back plane, you can see the bricks can get shallower or deeper, depending on where I put that plane. If you come up too shallow, you start to clip into the bricks. which can work pretty well for like an old castle wall. Like if you wanted to have a heavily weathered thing, you can pull it up to maybe here and you get all kinds of like rock chunks that are kind of sticking out and that kind of thing. Or push it back a little further to like a regular type thing for like a newish wall. Or if you really want to accent the separation between the bricks, you can push it way back, which means those crevices will be deep and stuffed full of ambient occlusion, so they'll be real dark. For our purposes, we're going to pull it up to maybe just before it starts to clip bricks for the most part, maybe there, right, which gives us a decent looking wall. Okay. Next step is we're going to grab all of those instances. Now let me save real quick because I've been tempting fate here a little bit. Okay, we're saved. So my final steps, once I'm happy with the way the wall looks, is I'll grab these, I'll change them all into regular meshes, which takes a second because MODO has to turn them into real geometry. We're up to 3.8 million triangles now, which is getting a little ugly. And that will take a second as the screen fades out. But the next step after this will be to create the low poly. And since we're doing a tiling texture, the low poly is really just going to be a flat polygon. So that's pretty straightforward. But I'll show you that here in a second. I'll pause the video till this finishes fooling around. Okay, fooling around complete. So now we've got this high poly mesh, and I've already exported this out to an FBX for baking purposes. Now we have to do the low poly, which is just going to be, like I said, a simple plane. But one of the first housekeeping things that I usually do is I select my high poly meshes and I delete any UVs that happen to be on them. And that's because that can mess with the baking. It just creates a mess. Generally, if your high poly has UVs on it, it's just best practices to punt it, in my opinion. Unless you're doing something weird where you need the UV, the high poly, or you've textured the high poly and you want to bake the textures down and stuff, but that's not what we're doing. So for our purposes, kill the UVs. Now, the best way to generate the low poly is just to grab that mortar plane that I made, or that mortar mesh that I made on the brick, make a new mesh item, paste it in there, and that's our low poly mesh. And I'll call it LP for simplicity. Now the one thing, he doesn't need normals. The one thing we do have to deal with on the low poly is UVs, but since it's just one polygon, if I do a planar projection, then we're done. Left, right, finished. We'll get into more complicated UV stuff obviously in the future, but for this is all we need. So I'm going to hop out of the UV editor. Now I generally make a cage for everything before I bake. It's just kind of a practice thing. Well, I won't say that I do a cage for everything, but I do a cage for most things. And we're going to do one here just for the sake of doing it. So once your low poly is UV'd and you've done all your hard edge breaks and stuff you're going to do, I duplicate that low poly. I rename it to LP underscore cage just for housekeeping purposes. And then I hit it with a push tool. And I just use the push tool to push it out until it gets past the high poly. And once I'm past, I'm done. Because it's going to cast its rays from those cage vertices to the low poly vertices. And as long as the high poly lies between those two, we're going to get a solid bake. So with that done, I'm going to export these out to FBX files, jump over to Substance Painter, and we'll meet up there again for the baking part of this. And in Substance Painter for the texturing portion of our program, I've pulled the low poly in. You can see it's over here waiting to get fed some normals. I've got the high poly set up, the cage set up, And we're going to bake out at 2048 just for the sake of picking a resolution. We don't need an ID map, so we'll just turn that off. Now, typically, I would selectively bake some of these channels, but we're just going to forge ahead for examples. So I'll just hit bake on this, and it's going to work on it. It shouldn't take too long, so hopefully I could just talk during this. We're going to pull this into Unreal Engine 4 afterwards, so you can see what it actually looks like in practice. We'll throw it onto some BSP cubes and stuff to prove that it's tiling correctly and all that junk. It doesn't have any artifacts. And actually I lied. Now I'm going to pause this and let this run its course, and when it's done, I'll come back. So as you can see, we've got it all baked out now, and you can see all the all the high poly details are coming through on this simple plane, which is what we wanted. And you can also see that the duplicated geometry that we had from left to right is now paying off, because we see this piece and this piece are tiling from left to right across the texture. That'll be more obvious once we get inside of Unreal Engine 4. So had this been a real asset, I would have put some sort of a material color on the mortar so I could easily mask it out, and give it a different texture and all that stuff. But for demo purposes, this is fine. So what I'm going to do is we'll just throw a simple texture on here, like one of these smart materials, just to get something on there and get it to look decent. So there we go. Now, this trick I covered in a different video, but I'll go over it again. What I usually do at the end of a texturing pass is I will take the curvature map that got baked out, make a new fill layer, and throw this into the base color. Turn off every channel except for base color, and then set it to overlay. Now it's too strong by default, so maybe take it back to 50 or something. Now, as you can see, with that off and when it on, off, on, it gives a good accent to all the edges, which works well with the art style that I generally do, which is sort of like a stylized realism. But whether that works for you or not is up to you to decide. But the bottom line is we have a nice tiling texture. And next up, I'm going to export this texture to Unreal Engine 4, and we'll see what it looks like. But first I wanted to look at the export settings, just so you know what they are. My standard export is really simple. I've got my diffuse and my normal. Yeah, that's all set up correctly. Then I have an ID texture. Now my ID texture is channel packed, so that my roughness goes in the red channel, my metalness goes in the green channel, and the ambient occlusion gets put into the blue. Those are all grayscale channels, so there's really no reason to have them off in their own textures and eating a lot of memory for no reason. So, having said all that, I'm going to export this. We'll go into Unreal Engine 4 and look at what it looks like. And here we are inside of Unreal Engine 4. Now, I imported the textures ahead of time. And the one thing that I generally do, that channel pack texture that I generated, I typically will call that up and set the compression settings to masks, because that's just how Unreal wants to have it. And it looks better. It tends to make it look correct. There's something internal there that I won't pretend to understand, but I just know that I need to do that. So if I make a new material in here, called tiling wall test, call it up. Now I just want to show you my material setup, because it's actually pretty super simple. We'll pull the diffuse in, the masks in, and the normal in. Now the diffuse goes to base, normals go to normal. That's all pretty straightforward. The way that we had packed this mask texture was the red goes to roughness, the green goes to metallic, the blue goes to ambient occlusion. That's just the way that I always do it, so I've got it memorized. You don't have to do it that way, but it's the most efficient way that I found so far. Close this and compile it. And then we should be able to just drag it onto this this floor mesh here. Let's see what it looks like. Let it compile and do what it's doing. And there we have it. And if I zoom back and look around in here, you can see this is tiling perfectly. There's no artifact. There's nothing. So there you have it. That's a quick way to make a tiling texture that looks good and will work inside of Unreal Engine 4. Yeah, it's fun just to play with. But anyway, yeah, I hope you found that useful. Thanks for watching. And a quick note before I go. In case you're wondering how far you can push this sort of method, this is another tiling texture that I made this morning, actually. I wanted to have a tiling skull texture that I could put, behind bars and things like that, or under floor panels or whatever. So building this this high poly out used the exact same method as the bricks, except that I used the mesh paint tool inside of MODO, which we'll get to in a future video. The mesh paint tool allows me to lay down each skull with a random rotation, random size, that sort of thing. And so with the instancing around the outside, this also creates a perfectly tileable texture. Using the same techniques and the same advantages. So yeah, I just wanted to show you that because this one's kind of fun and really shows what you can get, what you can get up to when you get experience with it. See you next time.